Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. That's Life, I Swear. I'm your host, Rick Barron. So, what was the 2015 Iran nuclear deal all about? Now, at the time of this recording, the United States and Iran are stuck in a bit of a stalemate. Blockades on both sides, bombings, ceasefire, on again, off again, and more. Now, President Trump has ridiculed President Barack Obama and the agreement, which he withdrew from during his first term. His critics say he could have avoided a war had he left it in place. In the high-stakes chess game of nuclear diplomacy, there are no clean victories, only calculated gambles. When Donald Trump walked away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, he promised a tougher and better deal. But years later, with tensions now simmering and Iran's nuclear ambitions advancing, a proactive question lingers. Did letting go of this imperfect plan clear the path to something stronger or something far more dangerous? Welcome to That's Life, I Swear. This podcast is about life's happenings in this world that conjure up such words as intriguing, frightening, life-changing, inspiring, and more. I'm Rick Barron, your host. That said, here's the rest of this story. The debate on how best to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions has spanned decades, shaped by shifting intelligence assessments, political philosophies, and the ever-present fear of nuclear proliferation in one of the world's most volatile regions. Now, at the center of that debate stands the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a landmark accord reached in 2015 that sought to place strict limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from punishing economic sanctions. For Barack Obama, the agreement represented a calculated effort to avoid another war in the Middle East while ensuring that Iran remained at a safe distance from developing a nuclear weapon. Now, for Donald Trump, it was a deeply flawed arrangement, one that he would later abandon in pursuit of what he promised would be a stronger, more permanent solution. Well, we're still waiting for that. The story of the Iran nuclear deal is not simply one of policy disagreement. It is a study in competing visions of power, diplomacy versus intimidation, incremental progress versus absolute guarantees, and the persistent challenge of managing risk in a world where certainty is rarely achievable. When Barack Obama entered office in 2009, Iran's nuclear program had already advanced significantly. Western intelligence agencies believed that Tehran had acquired the technical capability to enrich uranium to levels that, if further refined, could be used to produce nuclear weapons. Iran, for its part, maintained that its program was entirely peaceful, intended for energy production, medical research, and scientific advancement. Still, the concern among U.S. officials and their allies was not merely about what Iran had done, but what it could do. Before negotiations began in earnest, estimates suggested that Iran could produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in as little as 2 to 3 months if it chose to accelerate its efforts. That narrow window left little time for detection or response. So here's a quick note. Fissile material is a substance that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction, meaning its atoms can be split, a process called nuclear fission, in a way that releases energy and more neutrons, which go on to split additional atoms. Now, President Obama, cautious of military escalation after years of conflict in Iran and Afghanistan, sought a diplomatic path forward. He also faced pressure from allies, particularly Israel, where leaders feared that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose an existential threat. At the same time, Iran's economy was under severe strain from international sanctions that had cut it off from global financial systems and sharply reduced its oil exports. These converging pressures created an opening. Beginning in 2013, the United States joined a coalition of world powers, including Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union, to negotiate directly with Tehran. The talks were complex and often very contentious, stretching over 20 months and requiring compromises on all sides. The agreement that emerged in 2015 imposed sweeping restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities. Now, Iran agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium by approximately 98%, leaving it with far less material than would be required to produce even a single nuclear weapon. It also dismantled two-thirds of its installed centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium, and committed to using only older, less efficient models for a specified period. In addition, Iran accepted strict limits on the level to which it could enrich uranium, capping it at 3.67%, suitable for civilian purposes, but far from below the threshold required for weapons-grade material. Iran also agreed not to enrich uranium at its heavily fortified Fordo facility and to redesign a reactor that could have produced plutonium usable in nuclear weapons. Now, essentially, the deal established an extensive monitoring and verification regime overseen by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Inspectors were granted access to Iran's nuclear facilities, and surveillance mechanisms were put in place to track uranium production and centrifuge activity. Now, the goal of these measures were not to eliminate Iran's nuclear capabilities entirely, but to extend its breakout time, the period required to produce enough material for a bomb, to at least 1 year. This buffer was intended to provide the international community with sufficient warning to respond if Iran violated the agreement. Now, in return for these concessions, Iran received significant economic relief. The United States and its partners lifted a wide array of sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports, banking sector, shipping industry, and insurance markets. Iran regained access to tens of billions of dollars in previously frozen assets held abroad and was once again able to engage in international trade and investment. For many Iranians, the deal offered a hope of economic recovery and reintegration into the global economy. However, the extent of those benefits remains a subject of debate. Iranian officials later complained that lingering political uncertainty and the threat of renewed sanctions deterred foreign companies from fully re-entering the Iranian market. Now, critics of the agreement, both in the United States and abroad, argued that the sanctions relief provided Iran with financial resources that could be used to support allied groups and proxies in the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthi forces in Yemen. Supporters countered that the primary objective of the deal was nuclear non-proliferation, not regional geopolitics, and that the agreement should be judged on its ability to constrain Iran's nuclear program. Another point of contention was a $1.7 billion payment made by the United States to Iran shortly after the deal was implemented. The funds stemmed from a decades-old dispute over military equipment that Iran had paid for prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, but never received it. While U.S. officials agreed that the payment was a legal agreement, its timing coinciding with the release of several American detainees fueled allegations that it amounted to nothing but ransom. Among the most persistent criticisms of the agreement was what is called the sunset clauses. Now, what is that? These are key restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities were set to expire after 10 to 15 years, raising concerns that Iran could eventually expand its program within the bounds of the agreement. Opponents argued that this structure effectively delayed rather than prevented Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. They contended that the deal provided only a temporary solution to a long-term problem and risked legitimizing Iran's nuclear ambitions in the future. Now, the Obama administration officials acknowledged these limitations, but emphasized that the agreement was never intended to be the final word on Iran's nuclear program. Instead, they viewed it as a foundation for future diplomacy, a way to reduce immediate risk while creating opportunities for further negotiations. When Trump assumed the presidency, he brought a different perspective to the issue. Throughout his campaign and early years in office, he repeatedly criticized the nuclear deal as one of the worst agreements ever negotiated, arguing that it failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program, regional activities, and long-term nuclear capabilities. In 2018, Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the agreement and reimpose sweeping sanctions on Iran. The decision marked a turning point, effectively unraveling the framework that had governed Iran's nuclear activities for several years. In the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal, Iran initially remained in compliance with the deal's provisions, hoping that the other groups would find ways to preserve its economic benefits. However, as sanctions tightened and those benefits failed to materialize, Iran began to scale back its commitments. It increased uranium enrichment levels, expanded its stockpile, and installed more advanced centrifuges. The breakout time, which had once been extended to a year, began to shrink again, raising renewed concerns among international observers. The years following the U.S. withdrawal was marked by heightened tensions and periodic confrontations. Military strikes, covert operations, and cyber attacks underscored the fragility of the situation. Each side accused the other of provocation, while diplomatic efforts to revive or replace the agreement struggled to gain traction. Trump maintained that his strategy of maximum pressure would force Iran to accept a more comprehensive deal, one that addressed not only its nuclear program, but also its regional behavior and missile capabilities. Critics, however, argued that the approach had backfired, accelerating Iran's nuclear activities while increasing the risk of conflict. The central question became whether a better agreement was achievable or whether the original deal, despite its flaws, represented the most viable option under the circumstances. The Iran nuclear deal highlights the inherent complexity of international diplomacy. It illustrates how agreements are often shaped not by ideal outcomes, but by what is politically and practically achievable at a given moment. For policymakers, the challenge lies in balancing competing priorities, preventing nuclear proliferation, maintaining regional stability, avoiding military conflict, and addressing broader geopolitical concerns. Now, each decision carries consequences that can reverberate for years, if not decades. The story also underscores the importance of continuity in foreign policy. Agreements negotiated over years can be undone in a matter of months, if not days, changing the landscape and influencing the behavior of other nations. In this sense, the fate of the Iran nuclear deal serves as a reminder that credibility and consistency are critical components of effective diplomacy. Now, as debates continue over the best path forward, the fundamental dilemma remains unresolved. There is no consensus on whether diplomacy, economic pressure, or military action offers the most effective means of addressing Iran's nuclear ambitions. Each approach entails risk, uncertainties, and potential unintended consequences. Now, what is clear, however, is that the choices made by leaders such as Obama and Trump have had lasting impacts on Iran's nuclear program and the broader dynamics of the Middle East. In the end, the story of the Iran nuclear deal is less about a single agreement than about the enduring challenge of navigating a world where the stakes are high, the options are limited, and the outcomes are rarely definitive. It is a story of ambition, caution, disagreement, and the persistent search for a balance between security and stability, one that continues to unfold with each passing year. So what can we learn from this story? What's the takeaway? The hard truth is this: there was never a clean, risk-free option, only different kinds of trade-offs. And that's exactly what this story exposes. The 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, wasn't designed to solve the Iran problem. It was designed to buy time. It pushed Iran's breakout time for a bomb from a few months to about a year, creating breathing room for diplomacy or future action. Walking away from it didn't eliminate the threat. It changed the strategy to pressure and eventually military confrontation. The takeaway? In global security, abandoning imperfect diplomacy often means inheriting more volatile alternatives. Well, there you go, my friends. That's life, I swear. For further information regarding the material covered in this episode, I invite you to visit my website, which can be found on Apple Podcasts, for show notes and the episode transcript. As always, I thank you for the privilege of you listening and your interest. Be sure to subscribe here or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you soon.